So with this, I think we have come to the end of all these things. And next one we will have a panel discussion. So Hemant is going to do this panel discussion. He will moderate this panel discussion. So can we just set up a chair arrangement? How we'll do it? Yeah. So maybe just get it. So. So I would so this so the topic of this panel discussion is the opportunities and challenges of ramping up a fabless ecosystem in India. So and we would like to hear the VC perspective. We have a couple of venture capital folks here who are actually in some sense pure semiconductor venture funds. So I would like to invite Mr. Jalan to please come and take his seat on the stage. Hemant, you may just want to take it. Mr. Abhijit Datta, if he's in the room here. I saw him here, so maybe he has just stepped out. So I'll probably figure it out. I would also like to invite Mr. Sompal Chaudhary. He is partner in Bharat Innovation Fund. And to give a semiconductor, entrepreneur perspective, Sumit, please, come and take. Yeah, it's a surprise, man. Yeah. So just give me a minute and.
So, welcome everyone. This is a sort of in keeping up with the sort of an informal kind of a startup atmosphere. This is a totally free format kind of a panel discussion. There are a few questions. We haven't had the benefit of interacting and pre-agreeing on any of the questions, or at least kind of trying to steer the direction in a certain way. But just like a startup, I think we will, in the same spirit, keep a sort of a conversation and have the speakers talk about what is topmost on their minds in terms of this ecosystem. So I welcome all the panel members. I guess one of the panel members is expected to join us, but we'll get started. So the first thing is I would like to especially for all the panelists to start with making a short opening statement on what their perception is in terms of the fabless semiconductor ecosystem in India, business opportunities, how and whether they see it as a attractive opportunity for investment as well as a business, and how it relates to the country's strategic interests. So I'll start with yeah.
Thanks, Hemant. I think what Dr. Kiran Kumar, Sankhya Labs, and other people have talked about, it reminds me the day of 2006-7 when we formed the same IESA for getting the entire semiconductor ecosystem into the country. And it's almost 10 years that we are still working on it. And we are at least still standing on, fighting to get that ecosystem in the country. And what we have figured out that 10 years back also, that what can bring this industry into the country is only the consortium approach. And that is exactly what Next Orbit Ventures is working on. We have launched a $2 billion fund in 2016 specifically for semiconductor foundry, and then invest also into the ecosystem companies of fabless companies, design companies, product companies. And the good part is that recently a few of the industrialists has acknowledged uh, indirectly the next orbit model. Mr. Uday Kotak tweeted on June 28 that India's electronic imports have doubled in last 5 years, and now is creating a challenge for the current account deficit after oil. And Mr. Mahindra, Anand Mahindra tweeted immediately that this trend is going to escalate, and the only way possible is to start local manufacturing of the components, and for which the Indian companies who have the capital, technology, and staying power to compete to come together. And this is like reinforcement of what we are doing it. We have immediately reached out to them, and they have been given some few suggestions. If time permits, we'll do a small presentation. But I think the Fabless part, which IESA is now taking up, is one more step towards getting the foundry eventually. And that is what Next Orbit strongly believes in. And as a part of our investment drive, we are currently studying at least 4 or 5 deals in Fabless space, wherein they have now reaching a revenue stage after 4 or 5 years of investments and hard work. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I will speak. My previous role was completely into semiconductors. I was the MD of analog devices, being part of IESA for a long time. So now it's a bit of a different shoes as an investor. We are $100 million fund. We are not that big as Ajay, but so our focus is more on creating the next wave of innovation-led startups out of India. And we are not just focused on the semiconductor sector, right? So even though we are looking at it, I think Parag said it all in terms of the challenges and so forth that we see today, and those are realities on the ground, right? You can't deny that. So on one end, we would like to get kind of the focus of the government and the Make in India program and see whatever can be done with large industries, the defense sector, the ISRO sector, and so forth. So that should be one big aim, which I think all of us need to drive together. But I think from our fund focus standpoint, we are probably going to be playing in more as a pre-Series A, Series A kind of space, where the outcome needs to be not just from a manufacturing standpoint, it eventually needs to be an outright sale, right? So the way we are looking at is what are the technologies that these startups are developing that might actually be very competing globally. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be an acquisition by an Indian guy. It has to be an acquisition by a global major. So what are the areas? So anything that is probably commodity IP, we are probably not going to be looking at it. Any specific pieces like, for example, what Steridian is doing, like Alpha ICs is doing, and so forth, is interesting for us, right? But again, these IPs, these pieces that are being created needs to be comparable to what is going on globally, right? So one of the big challenges that we face and is overall in the ecosystem, pretty much what Parag mentioned. So historically, we have been told to our MNC R&D centers, we have been told to our service providers what chip to design. We are extremely good at it. We are extremely competent at it. I think the skills that we lack is the product marketing management piece of the value system, the actual relationships and so forth from a sales standpoint. So I think from a team perspective, I am open to actually looking at teams which have a good technology guy and as well as a solid business guy. Maybe this business guy is based out of US. In fact, that is probably preferred, right? Who has the connections and so forth. He can knock on the doors of the OEMs, the ODMs, and open these doors up, right? So there are multiple challenges today, but I think what we are trying to see is as I meet with a startup, how are they thinking through the entire process? Are they thinking through just building up a technology, building up a chip, taping out a chip, testing the chip, and then taking the next steps? Or have they looked through, mapped out the ecosystem? They know whom they are going to be talking to. What are the different OEMs looking at? What at least have they talked to these OEMs? What is the competitive landscape today? I mean, at least today, going around Bangalore, you can figure out what is the roadmap, what are these guys working on. You can find this intel, right? So that's one aspect. The second aspect we would be looking for is, as we understand through the ecosystem via Parag, it is a long gestation period for these semiconductor chips, right? So it is going to be a good amount of phased funding that is required. So if you look at the incubator model, and this is great what JC and all of you guys have set up, this is phenomenal to get things started, right? To get the first test chip out, to kind of evaluate the chip, maybe put up a system together and then take the next steps. But follow-on funding from a seed investor, from a Series A investor, from a Series B investor, right? And frankly speaking, globally, there's only a handful of guys today. So maybe to a certain extent, lining them up, right, in a sequence. See, we will feel much more confidence if, for example, and JC, I'm putting you on the spot, that Intel Capital is already kind of giving a thumbs up, right? So anyway, so that's probably a decision kind of together, right? So it's a very, think about the fact from a VC perspective, it's a very risky business, right? It's a handful of players who are going to acquire. Right? You heard from Parag the timeline it takes and so forth as well. And a fund lifetime is 8 years max. So the first 4 years you invest, the next 4 years you give returns. So if it's beyond 8 years, a fund like us cannot give returns back to our investors. Okay, so I'll stop right here, but you kind of understand the landscape. And if we gonna invest in a couple of these startups, it has to be unique, right? At least competitive globally. They have to have a business person on board, I would say, to start making the rounds. Even before the chip is out, they need to make the rounds with investors, with OEMs, with ODMs, and so forth. And the third aspect is probably some kind of lining up strategy, at least talking with the seed guys, the Series A guys, the Series B guys, and so forth, to kind of get an appetite. It's not a commitment, but an appetite to see what these guys are thinking through would probably be a good piece.
So I'll speak from a Fabless entrepreneur perspective. Of course, to answer your question of whether we see Fabless as a future or as opportunities in that area, definitely. And that's really our focus. So I think the key there is, as Parag has also highlighted, is identifying the relationships, getting into the ecosystem. So if you know that, then you identify your product segment. Of course, technology is available and there's a lot of talent available. But the key is to get into the right ecosystem and the supply chains. And once you can do that, then there's a sustainable business, which is possible. It doesn't necessarily have to be always funded business only from a VC point. It will become automatically after that. But finding the right, getting into the global supply chains, that's the key, and that's possible. I think the key is that more and more we make that happen. We believe that is possible. So we have had small successes, but that tells us that it is possible.
So, by the way, I think one thing that all of the panelists, all of the audience hadn't heard about it. Cyril Sumit's company is the first Indian company, Fabless company, that has shipped 20 million chips, into the global market. So here, right here, we have an example of a very scalable and successful startup here. Coming to the next, so I'll start with some of the questions that I had made a note of. So we hear, in some of the earlier interactions at IESA Vision Summit, that there seems to be some sort of a renewed interest from VCs in terms of Fabless. How true is that? I mean, is that any? Is it? Yeah. 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 Welcome, Abhijit. So, I'll repeat the question. So basically, is there any renewed interest in fabless semiconductors in terms of global semiconductor, startups? And if there are any favorite themes or anything that you would like to add on that? And when it comes to your turn, then you could probably expand on your opening statement as well, Abhijit.
See, again, it depends upon the theme that the VCs are working on. So, as Bharat Innovation Fund, could be the one who will be looking up. Maybe he'll validate that. If their focus is on only the fabless or the IT and the combination of those sorts. Our theme is that the fabless companies has to support the foundry that we are working on, because specifically we feel very strongly that once the foundry is there, uh, not necessarily that the biggies will come and get the chips manufactured out here. So the investments also that we have done so far is basically creating a pipeline for the foundries that we are partnered with, and eventually those chips will be manufactured as and when the foundry in the country will be up and running it. So our strategy is that identify such fabulous companies, such products that can ultimately come out of foundries.
Are there any specific plans you have in terms of what nodes that would come up in the foundry?
Yeah, so specifically for that purpose, we have recently concluded a study with Frost and Sullivan. It almost took a year, and they have studied the entire Indian market. And the mandate of the study was that tell us what nodes is required for the digital fab, what nodes are required for the analog fab, and what is the trend for the next, say, 2025 onwards. So yes, they have identified, and as we talk, our discussions with our foundry partners have started on negotiating for those initial nodes, and also the roadmap for the next, by 2025, the next node will be.
That's interesting. I think it's good to know that there is this sort of a possibility, and that's probably a perspective that the startups in this audience and outside could drive themselves towards. So, Abhijit, I'll give you an opportunity.
So I'll react to your question, which is what vertical and what market is the demand coming from? Let's start with that. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath with this airport exercise in the morning. Yeah. So now I represent 10x2, which is a Hong Kong-based accelerator and M&A firm. Now we see a lot of inquiries coming in, and that's what I escalated to Ashok, and that's how we connected. Coming for Indian system on chip, if you may call it, and future versions of it. Now, the verticals that the requirements are coming from, to elaborate on it, is I'll take a statement by a Canadian author called Don Tapscott. He's come out with a couple of books, Wikinomics and Macroeconomics. So in one of the sessions that I attended of Don, he said that let's not celebrate having 6 billion SIM cards out there, because it's going to multiply 10x. In the sense that he said that my sprinkler would have a SIM card, my washing machine would have a SIM card, etc., etc. So the multiplication, if I may say, of the opportunities coming from that end. To put it exact in verticals, we see from our perspective smart mobility, hence system on chip which fit into electric vehicles, drones, smart tractors, aviation. That's one sector where a demand for complete system is coming from. The second vertical that we see is smart energy. Now, that's whether it's optimizing lithium-ion, batteries, going up to the value chain, right to IoT management of lighting systems at home, for example. So there's a huge traction coming from there. The third vertical that we clearly see is wearables and IoT devices, agri-tech. And that's something which I think was talked about in the earlier session as well, is where the vertical fitment of systems and chips is arriving from. I think that's the visibility that I have.
I'll probably take a slightly different tack. I think what's happening is, yes, from an IoT perspective, the 50, 60 billion devices and so forth, those will proliferate. The prices are going to be in the pennies. It's going to be mostly high volume. And I think, frankly speaking, the established players will take the lion's share of that market, right? I mean, it's very difficult for a startup to kind of come in and they might succeed initially building a chip, building a system on a chip, but as the volumes grow, the big players will automatically come in. And if it's a 6 to 9 months of an effort of building that specific chip, uh, they might get acquired for small amount of money, or just the big guys will do it on their own. I think the innovation, what we are seeing. So why I think Hemant's question was why this renewed interest of global VC funds in terms of semiconductors suddenly, right? It was an extremely dry period for the past 10 years. I think even in the valley, there were just Lippu, Walden was doing investments in chip startups, that too in China mostly. And there was another VC fund called Taproot Ventures, I believe, and they shut shop probably 2009, 2010, right? So why this renewed initiative? I think everything kind of coming down to ML and AI, right? And if you start looking at least 10 to 15 startups, including guys like Mystic, like Mobileye, and so forth, that have got funded and acquired as well. And you see both kind of accelerators, ML accelerators, AI accelerators at the edge and as well as the cloud. That's probably driving a renewed interest by the VC funds in new kind of processor designs and so forth, because the traditional piece is just not working, right? And that is on the same lines as we have in India. If you see, morphing machines, we have Alpha ICs and Manjira Systems, Westgard Technologies. These kind of companies are also kind of on that path. So I would say that is one cause of the renewed interest from the investors. But the traditional big volume play will come in from the established players as well.
So, from a limited perspective of analog mixed signal area, for us the key drivers in terms of verticals. I mean, I'm not saying that it's necessarily that is the only thing which is driving investment. So for us, it's battery management, new more and more low power systems for wearables. Those are the verticals that we are focusing on, and we believe that those will drive volumes. Not really. Yeah. So we are working on partnerships and funding. Yeah.
Yeah. So the another part was, do you see any impact of the fact that the unlikely companies like Facebook, Apple, Google, and so on, they have entered into the semiconductor domain, right? I mean, you hear about large teams being set up. What do you see the impact of this, and does that create some sort of an opportunity for the fabless companies to, from a VC perspective, that is probably one of the angles that you will see is what is the acquisition potential, right? So now that there are these new age kind of companies, who are not traditionally known as semiconductor companies, getting into that, how do you see that, creating new opportunities for startups and for your investment objectives? Do you see any influence of that? That is one part. And the second is also, how do you see the effect of this consolidation of companies? I mean, like, for example, we have heard about, of course, some of them didn't go through, but, large mergers, about to happen and kind of getting stalled. How do you see this super consolidation? Do you see that creates opportunities for smaller players, because now they move much faster and hopefully they can innovate faster? Do you see any impact on both of these?
See, I would say the consolidation part which is happening both at China level as well as the US and Europe level, it's an opportunity as well as challenge for India ecosystem to scale up. So yes, anything which comes out innovative model would be of interest for the traditional VCs or the new age VCs which is coming in India. As far as the big names that you've talked about, Facebooks and who are coming up in this space, you rightly said that the AI and ML is the new age technologies which is driving those consolidations, because they are into the sectors where more of the AI and ML applications are required.
From our perspective, from where we see it, whatever's happening on the software side is probably, yes, that's nice to have, and more players getting into it is great, and that'll drive a lot of AI and chipset level integrations. But having said that, how we look at it is, where is the next markets? So it's India, China, Indonesia. If you sum up the population and the growth, that's where the next markets are. Now, how we look at it is that the hardware players in these markets, let's say China, for example, or we've got inquired. So we just finished an M&A on behalf of a Chinese principal, and we acquired a Taiwanese company, a semiconductor company, essentially to fit in a ready-made hardware requirement. So the fabs were there, they just needed the design to start production. So there's a synergies happening. So how we look at it is, wherever the markets are, those guys are getting up and saying, do we want to go to the big players? Or do we want to look at customized options for our hardware, which is uniquely created in a synergy-led manner? And these kind of discussions are also coming out of hardware manufacturers in Germany, by the way, and Poland, Europe, saying that can we look at Indian design skills to complement our hardware roadmap and come up with interesting collaborative closed units? And that's where we see a kind of traction happening.
Yeah, regarding your consolidation piece, guys, it was bound to happen, right? Whenever you see an industry for the past 5-10 years, the volumes are going up, and the industry is flat and the prices are going down, right? So it's bound to happen, and I think it's good for the industry in that sense, because after this consolidation, they will start having better pricing power, which means they would start investing more and more into R&D. So that's a good sign. And it has happened, if you look at for the past 100 years, it has happened for the car industry, it has happened for other multitude of other industries. It's a growth path, it's a period of saturation, and then a bunch of consolidation, right? So it's nothing new, which essentially tells us that the semiconductor industry has reached kind of a maturation phase, okay? But again, these new age MLAI, the new types of processors and so forth, putting in CNNs and so forth inside the edge, those are the new age opportunities. Now, regarding your first question about, so I think from a startup perspective, it becomes a bit tricky. The number of potential acquirers actually get reduced, right? But you'll not have to run around and figuring out the story, what everybody is trying to do, right? So you know who are the takers, you talk with these two folks, the Intels and Qualcomms of the world, end of story, right? On the Google, Apple, Facebook, yes, these guys are getting more and more vertically integrated. I may speak, and I think the good news is these guys are in a major acquisition mode as well, right? So that's an opportunity for the startups. But frankly speaking, trying to understand what these guys are doing and trying to build, I think it would probably be a difficult hardware play. The softwares and the API play would be much easier. But if you have some kind of an unique hardware opportunity which speeds things up, say in the TPU TensorFlow, that could be a potential. I think so it's difficult. I probably haven't gone down to the depths to understand what could be the potential opportunities as yet, but it remains to be seen.
Yeah, so the software companies or larger system companies doing chips of their own. From our perspective, those, if you have technology which have synergies, those are business opportunities, and could be even M&A opportunities, but more business opportunities. And I think sometimes things like that, there could be point opportunities, but they could help you build new technology along with a big customer. So definitely those are good opportunities. For instance, if Facebook is doing VR and you can build a system along with them, that's an opportunity definitely. And the second one regarding consolidation, yeah, I think that, as Som said, that was bound to happen. But again, those are all, from a startup perspective, those are also opportunities, because then you find opportunities because bigger companies always the growth, the pace of innovation is slower than a startup. So that means you have no newer opportunities where you can focus on, where the focus of the bigger company is less.
It's very likely post these transitions they are at a standstill as well.
That's where the opportunity is better. I think the comment which Avijit made, so it's actually very relevant to my next question. Now we have seen different types of models of startups and companies emerging out of India. One is, we can say, something like a replicate model, where we have a Flipkart, parallelly with Amazon. There is a localized company which is like Redbus. It's also uniquely Indian problem. Nothing to do with, you can't take this and sell tickets in US, right? And which is hyper localized. But there is a big market, and as you rightly said, which I agree, is that India as a market itself is a very big opportunity, and we have this probably mindset that everything must be exported for it to become a valuable business. So that's another side of it. I mean, it's not the only way to succeed. And then the third one is basically a global model, which Sumit referred to, where, and Som also mentioned, that you are basically, there's nothing, it's context independent, you are competing on the global platform, and if you have a chip that does something much better than everyone else in the world, and people will comment on it. So do you see all of these, what are your thoughts on these different models? And where are the best opportunities for, given specifically for the Indian context and Indian fabless companies? So,
yeah. So two points. I think the replica model. I don't know if this should work from a semiconductor standpoint, right? because frankly speaking, say somebody is is uh, is already globally selling million, because semiconductor is a volume game, right? So somebody is selling millions of chips already, and now you're trying to go from day one to build up an Indian market, only playing the Indian market, which would probably have a slow ramp rate. You're not going to get the pricing and so forth anyway, right? The second point about the global innovation piece, I think that's a big push from our fund, and we should see a bunch of these pieces happening, right? The third piece is very interesting. So that really depends on which specific sectors, which specific areas we together believe have the potential. So one piece, I'm just thinking aloud out here. One could be this IRNSS satellites, right, that we have already sent. Why don't we create essentially a very dedicated chip which works for that, right? And then the government kind of mandates that every mobile phone gotta have that piece. Okay, and for security reasons and so forth, it gotta have that. You can look at very specific smart city markets and so forth, where there is an opportunity, because in the private world, you cannot probably, because of WTO regulations and so forth, you cannot do a preferential market access piece, right? But there are potential areas, maybe it's in telecom, in the smart city piece, maybe showcasing security and aspects and so forth, the set-top box market for CAS and so forth. There could be potential only those points if the government regulates, then it's a substantial market. And those are the potential India-only plays that we can go after.
I would agree. So strategic and government driven. Those are the places where clearly India specific products or India specific ecosystem could be created. Um, other than that, it's really a global thing. Of course, the local thing we have seen in Taiwan, in China, and other places. When you have a local manufacturing ecosystem, there is a part of the business that comes to the local companies, but that we are not yet there. So that piece may happen in the future as more and more manufacturing happens. But other than that, I would think that the primary model would still have to be the global.
So the question was about India play and the global play. So at both the levels, I see the India play. Let's talk about that. Mera Bharat Mahan. So can we do something to integrate here together? I'll start off with probably the list of the 10,000 hardware guys that NASCOM has incubated. And there's some wonderful list there. If you scan through that list, what you'll see is they're thinking specialized. Like, I'll take a couple examples. Wagger, they're doing an IoT for dogs only, right? They want to be bought by Pedigree sometime down the line. So you have these unique cases coming up and etc. But what they're doing is they're creating the entire systems on existing setup and not experimenting with Indian semiconductor startups. So that's the India piece. But having said that, as rightly pointed out, the volumes will never be there for probably the next 5 years. So what do? You play the Indian political card, which is bilateral. You do coupling. So you say, okay, India, Germany, can we do, you already have a market. Can I take it there? While India kind of builds up and ramps up on the volume, can we have a both market strategy together to hit those volumes? And these are interesting pockets that are emerging because of the elephant in the room, which is Mr. Trump and trade wars. I'm kind of addressing that. So having said that, what's happening is these little pockets in the global scenarios emerging. It's not going to be one brush painted all kind of a scenario going forward. So to me, that looks an interesting piece.
Just want to add though, right? I mean, a word of caution about, so if you already have a sustaining business, great, you can rely or put some bets on the regulatory pieces, the diplomatic pieces between the governments and so forth. But if you're building up your business just based on that, that would be a very hard sell.
Especially if Indian government is one of those. Okay.
No, fully supports that. In fact, the same point comes up. The Fabless company that we are evaluating currently has smartly played on that. So they have left away the cellular piece because that is where their big daddy Qualcomm is sitting up, and they are now focusing only on the IoT piece and the modem piece, and that is where now they have scaling up. They are getting a good tractions from the Chinese vendors as well as with other vendors. So yes, it is. It is like has to be like, find out your niche and then scale up on that part of it. Directly fighting with biggies like Intel's and Qualcomm will be just a bloodbath. And as rightly said by Sankalp, that it's like teeny many insects in front of them. How to survive, that's more important.
Final, I think we are probably, I'm not sure what's our time deadline. Anyone, any time? Can we have? I think it's 12:30. What is the lunch break? Oh, okay, okay. It's like startup, right? Okay, okay. So, I think the next question is in terms of ecosystem, right? What is lacking? What do all of you see as lacking in terms of fabless companies? And do you see any patterns or strategies that have been used in other countries which we could replicate? I know, we are a democracy, but that's oftentimes maybe we should question why that is a liability. But do you see any way forward, right? Going forward, whether anything the government can do, and if we keep the government out of equation, then whether the private companies like what Parag was alluding to, like a mothership kind of an approach where a bigger company sees a startup as a force multiplier and enables it strategically. So this is not necessarily a VC driven, but a strategic driven model.
See, our experience is that we are there from last 10 years. Government is not going to do anything. They just do a lip service. They keep talking about the fabs, foundries, ecosystems, and all that, but they are just there for making papers. And that is where we have changed our strategy. That don't rely on the government. Form a consortium of all the like-minded technology partners, ecosystems, companies, investors, and get together, and together we can do it. The government will always follow. They will not take a lead, at least in India. Rightly said, in China, it's Chinese government versus the private companies. Trump is taking a cue from that. He is standing for his own country. Whether India will stand or not, there was a confidence that the current Prime Minister will take that initiative. But I think the accumulation of the negative energy has been so much with the concerned department who handles that he is also finding it very difficult. So we feel that it's only the consortium approach. Together we can do it. Government will follow thereafter.
So do you see any fora where this could be done across different private players?
No, as I said, in my initial speech, the first answer question is that Uday Kotak tweeted about it and Anand Mahindra tweeted about it, and he suggested the way, and that is where our investors also, who have given a commitment of more than $750 million, who have invested heavily into the foundries, is that standalone foundry will not be a feasible idea. It is an ecosystem approach that will work. So the right way, I think, is that get together, let's do it. So for example, what IESA is doing for Fabless, a similar approach has to be done for the foundry part of it, and the entire thing. So one of the points that we missed out is that In this study that we have done from the Frost and Sullivan, they have given the number of $810 billion India's electronic market by 2025. And this is based on the extensive study of 187 electronic products that they have done and the consumption patterns that they identified. So it's not $400 billion by 2022, it's $810 billion that they're talking about. And the kind of semiconductors that will go into that, China is playing all that game, which has made US worried about it, is that they are importing $200 billion of semiconductors. And we all know, with all due respect, that they have using all the strategy on the books, steal, borrow, invest, throw the money, because for them, the country is paramount. The China 25 plan talks about that we don't have to rely on the overseas companies for the basic core technology which drives the economic development and the militarization of the country. So if the government is not waking up, let's we Indians, we industrialists wake up, get together and make it happen. Otherwise, India will not be relevant in say next 10 years, 15 years time.
I completely agree with you, and I think the initiative, as you pointed out, is India is complicated, right? The democracy of it. But having said that, it's as you rightly pointed out, the private entities need to come in. Here, the concept of an ODM is getting redefined, if I may say so. Now, it's not a tablet or a mobile, so it's the Mahindra Group or Hero's electric vehicle is becoming the ODM in the ecosystem. So these ODMs essentially will cluster, I feel, the technology around it, and the leads have to come from there, whether this room full of community goes and pushes them towards that direction is probably what needs to be seen.
Yeah, so I think the how we've all come together for Safal, right? So we just need to grow this community and build this up, and we have got several case examples as well. Look at what iSpirit has done for the Indian product innovation ecosystem, right? Software products ecosystem. These guys built up Aadhaar stack just based on a bunch of volunteers. We have got credible pieces what iSpirit has done. We are trying to similarly IESA and TIE, we are trying to do exactly replica with IoT Forum. For the past 4 years, we've been trying to list out all the IoT startups, create a community, help each other, bring the investors and the other entire ecosystem together. This year we have M&A and exit kind of a discussion ongoing. So I would probably like to see Safal kind of taking ownership of the entire Fabless ecosystem, be it kind of collaboration with the government, with the startups, with the potential Indian ODMs, right? And build this community up. And maybe today there is 10 startups. Maybe in the 5 years, let's keep it a goal that at least we gotta have 50 startups in this space, and maybe 5 of them are successful ones, which means 15, 20 plus million in revenue at least, right? Let's set up some goals and initiatives on that. So I think, the only piece in India, what we have is we have multiple groups, we have multiple interests, and we never work together, right? And it's a very diluted effort that we do. So I think the goal for us is we've created this initiative. Now let's all join hands, be it kind of the investor community, be it the startups, be it the government, be it the guys, the strategic sector, and let's just ride on Safal and see what we can do. A single community, a single voice for Fabless ecosystem.
That's an interesting point. And you think that on IoT and Fabless, like two of the groups, right? Is there any synergy? I think this is a very good point, because across, say, for example, I don't know, NASCOM or CII or LCNA, right, which is manufacturing side. Similarly, IoT, right? If these groups sort of exchange ideas, and if there are any grand plans where with the entire end-to-end kind of a deployment plan that would bring the whole country, maybe, I don't know, make use of this market, and everyone benefits from it. Do you think there is scope for that?
So I think first of all, IoT deployments have to happen, right? That hasn't happened yet in India. So that as the volume kind of grows up and so forth, that will dictate, that will automatically feed into the Shuffle folks and say, guys, here are the requirements coming. So the collaboration is essential, but today I don't think we can get a chip out at a high price and start selling to the OEM ecosystem, right? Today, that's the challenge. But I think the communication needs to happen. It's frankly, I mean, if we start now, it's a 5-year roadmap. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not going to happen overnight. It's a 5-year roadmap. It's going to be a slow, steady progress. But I think if we join hands, we know what is going on globally, right? So within Shuffle, I think one of the biggest help we can provide, besides the funding is going to get us from point zero to level, 2 maybe, right? And this is more in terms of getting some tools and so forth, getting a test chip done. So that's, I would say, stage 2. But getting on to stage 10, it will require a lot of hand-holding in terms of the access to markets, in terms of understanding these markets, in terms of understanding what is the ecosystem moving forward to. And it's going to be a journey, right? So we need the stakeholders. I think entire ecosystem, we need to get involved a foundry guy, right? Who understands the foundry ecosystem. We need the OEM ecosystem guys, right? We need to put up kind of maybe a market access special interest group within Shuffle together.
Yeah, so we have to work on, firstly we have to understand how the ODMs today in India, they're not exactly ODMs, but probably going to be ODMs in future. Today, mostly they are almost picking ready-made solutions. So, but how do we work with them to firstly? So today, almost no Indian company has got a design into Reliance or Tata. They're making the auto. So firstly, that we exist, we have to announce. So I think, and that solutions are possible. So we work together as the Fabless Conclave and see what solutions we can make, and maybe identify a vertical and go after. If it is Reliance, then maybe see how we can access that market. Maybe they are the customer's customer, maybe they're not the customer still. But at least educate them that a solution is possible. I don't know whether they know even.
I can tell you they know very well. And without naming names, back at Analog Devices, we struggled for 2 years supporting this particular customer, right? Going through the pains and perils of a design in and everything. And next day, fine morning, they simply get a dabba from somewhere else, right? End of story. So these things happen as well.
That's why I said you should have friends there, right? If you're a friend, you won't do it.
Absolutely.
Another thing this thought is my most important point. I mean, as far as I don't know this side, is that the value grew because of allegiance to a cause, not allegiance to a company. The problem in India is we have too much allegiance to a company. That's the issue that we have. So if you have a friend on the other side, he will exactly tell you what he wants, right? And then being your friend, he'll help you out. So that's what is missing. That's the big thing that's missing.
I think we are running out of time also, so maybe.
We are running out of questions.
So any questions from the audience side? Yeah.
I actually walked in a little late, so I don't know if this question was answered or not. But in the community of fabless companies, how do you guys see the advantage of having a local fab in India, say, even a small fab, 8-inch fab, for you to do rapid prototyping, testing, get your designs out there? I don't know if this question was answered, and
So we do not see that as an impediment to the growth of the fabless industry as of now. Uh, with the fab, maybe some of the other facilities like failure analysis or some things would be more readily available. Uh, but we don't see that as a major issue at this point, because you can pretty much go to any of the global foundries and I mean and get the prototyping done. So
But are you in their priority list, or are you at the back end of their priority?
yeah, I think that's a challenge, but yeah, so maybe that will yeah. So in terms of yeah, so we haven't had that as the biggest issue so far from our perspective.
But I think that's where SUFFLE could help, right? As an IESA industry body, if we have say that, hey, we are going to be doing like 2 shuttles or 3 shuttles, and go via this consortium, then I think we would have better pricing power, better priority power, and so forth as well.
Yeah. Yeah. If talking about it from SUFFLE's perspective and saying we're creating a closed ecosystem where the prototyping, etc., and fine-tuning it also happens within this ecosystem, I think that'll be a great advantage from a speed perspective.
I'll add my perspective here. Basically, like I agree with Sumit on in terms of what priority we get. It has changed over time because today you have the VCA model, which TSMC has evolved, and foundries are a lot more accessible now than they were earlier. Uh, but it would definitely be an advantage if in terms of mass production, because one of the things that as Parag mentioned we faced was a sort of because you're coming from an Indian semiconductor company, there's no track record. They're not like 100 different semiconductor companies generating business for TSMC. So you may not, or any foundry. I mean, I should not probably. It's not politically correct to name just one foundry, but you wouldn't get the kind of differential pricing that a startup at a similar stage would get, say in a different country which is known for its fabless number of companies. So if that turns out to be an advantage, it would definitely be a welcome move, and it has to be the right node. Finally, what happens is every market dictates what is the sweet spot. You try to stretch. Of course, you have to match between the affordability and the overall production per chip cost trade-offs. But if those nodes are available and you get better pricing, and maybe I don't know, there's something like which says if you manufacture and design in India, then you get certain government concessions. Things like that would definitely encourage. So that's something I would say. It's not a big handicap, but it's something that is welcome and open from our point of view.
What are those node levels? Just like you mentioned.
Sorry?
The node levels you mentioned. What are those right node levels for India?
Nodes? Oh, nodes. Well, it's not, we can't generalize. It's very specific to a particular product. I mean, as earlier it was mentioned that some of the power management chips could go at 180 nanometer, some analog chips could go at that. For agriculture markets, it's not power sensitive. And if you get good, sensible pricing, then 180 nanometer is not a problem. But if you are, for example, shipping a chip which is going to compete globally in say an IoT application, then you would need to look at 28 nanometer or below, to get the lowest power and cost. So it's difficult to generalize what is a good node. It would vary.
See, if you are looking for developing the entire ecosystem, the ecosystem of India-focused product or India-required products, then definitely it will help that you have the design companies as well as the foundry and all that. So if you are just looking in a current scenario, which is wherein you are making the products for a global market, then may not be. But if you have to start the whole ecosystem, then it is, and that is where we have been asked to, and then that's where we are working on.
Any other questions? All right, very well. So I think thank you very much to all the panelists.
Thanks.
And I would just like to invite Purnima, who is our IESA founding president as well, and the current EC member, to hand over a moment, a token of our appreciation to the VCs on the stage, because you work with them a lot, running your own incubator. So please, come and. No, I think. So, so before we break for lunch, right after this, we'll have the lunch ready out there in the room. I just sort of give my impression what I have been hearing since morning, and again, in form of a small story. So here is this guy who's actually sailing his boat in a very stormy night, and he got stuck in a whirlpool. And his boat started rotating and sinking because he's stuck in a whirlpool. And that is when the lightning struck, and he saw other guy right there actually dancing in joy. So he is very upset. He's saying that here I am dying a slow death, and here is this guy who's actually enjoying and actually dancing. But next moment he realizes that other guy also is stuck in a whirlpool, and he's also rotating, which he thought is dancing. So, so I think that is the stage of our ecosystem. I think entrepreneur has said that he had faced issues with VCs and governments. I heard a VC telling that government doesn't move. We have fair amount of government representation here. We have Mr. Datta, who actually spearhead lot of initiative in METI. I think each one of us have our own struggles, and the key word here is what Parag said is collaboration, right? I think we have all the pieces which are there. We have people who have money and willing to invest in technology sector. We have entrepreneurs, very passionate entrepreneurs who can actually make things happen, who can actually harness the power of technology, and we have government who wants to do things, and of course we have people sitting from IESC, so a very able academic system in the country, right? I think it's just that somehow it's our inability to get all these pieces together. So on this note, I think I will request all of you to please head for lunch, and we'll meet in about 30 minutes, because